The sun beat down mercilessly on the streets of New York City that December afternoon. In the luxurious interior of a latest model Mercedes, Richard Mendoza adjusted the air conditioning while waiting for the light to change on Fifth Avenue. At 45, the entrepreneur had built an empire in the technology sector, transforming a small startup into one of the largest companies in the country. Through the tinted windows, he observed distractedly the hustle and bustle of the metropolis when a shout caught his attention. "Mister, please buy a candy. I'm hungry." The childish voice made him turn his head, meeting the pleading gaze of a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. The boy, whose name was Peter, held a basket of homemade sweets with trembling hands. His worn-out t-shirt and tattered flip-flops contrasted drastically with the prosperous scene around him. For a moment, Richard hesitated, as he always did, when faced with the numerous street vendors that populated the city's traffic lights. But something in that look instantly transported him back 35 years, when he himself sold candy at the traffic lights in the suburbs to help his mother, Mrs. Clara, who was raising 3 children alone. The memory, long dormant, hit him like a punch to the stomach. "How much does it cost?" he asked, lowering the car window. "If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories." Continuing. $5 each, mister, Peter replied, approaching hopefully. Richard took out his wallet and pulled out a $50 bill. "Keep the change," he said, taking only 1 chocolate truffle. The boy's eyes shone with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you so much, sir. God bless you." At that moment, a young woman approached hurriedly. "Peter, what did I tell you about approaching cars?" It was Mary, the boy's older sister, who also sold handicrafts in the area to help support the family. "Sorry, Mary, but look, the man gave me $50. Peter showed the bill, while Mary looked suspiciously at Richard. "Sir, you didn't have to," she began, but Richard gently interrupted her. "Don't worry, I've been on the other side of this window too," he replied, surprising himself with his own sincerity. The light turned green, but Richard couldn't accelerate immediately. Something held him there. "Do you work here every day?" Mary hesitated before answering. "Yes, sir. My brother and I take turns to care for our mother, who is sick." Richard took a business card from the glove compartment and handed it to Mary. "Show up at this address tomorrow at 9 a.m. I want to talk to you and your parents." Before Mary could respond, a horn sounded behind Richard's car, reminding him that the light was green. He drove off, watching in the rearview mirror the figures of Mary and Peter, who seemed to be discussing what had just happened. In the office of Mendoza Tech, located on the 40th floor of one of the most imposing skyscrapers on Fifth Avenue, Richard couldn't concentrate on the meetings that afternoon. His mind constantly wandered to the encounter at the traffic light. Carla, his assistant for over a decade, noticed his restlessness. "Did something happen, Mr. Mendoza?" Richard swiveled in his leather chair, contemplating the panoramic view of the city. "Carla, do you believe in destiny?" The assistant raised her eyebrows, surprised by the philosophical question from her always pragmatic boss. "What do you mean?" "Today I met a boy selling sweets at the traffic light. He reminded me so much of myself. I ended up inviting him and his sister to come here tomorrow." Carla smiled, knowing well her boss's story of overcoming adversity. "And what do you plan to do?" "I'm not sure yet," Richard replied thoughtfully. "But something tells me this encounter wasn't by chance." What Richard didn't know was that casual encounter at the traffic light would trigger a series of events that would change not only Peter and Mary's lives, but also his own. Fate had intertwined their stories in a way that none of them could have predicted, and the consequences of this connection were only beginning to unfold. The next morning, Mary hesitated in front of the imposing mirrored building. She firmly held Peter's hand while their father, George, looked intimidated at the construction that seemed to touch the sky. The family had decided to accept the mysterious businessman's invitation, more out of curiosity than hope. "Are you sure this is where he told us to come?" asked George, nervously adjusting the neatest shirt he could find. Mary checked the crumpled card once more. "Yes, Dad, Mendoza Tech, 40th floor." At the reception, they were greeted by Carla, who was already waiting. Her welcoming smile eased the tension of the moment a bit. "You must be the family Mr. Mendoza is expecting. Please, follow me." The panoramic elevator provoked expressions of amazement from Peter, who had never been in such a high place. Mary, for her part, tried to maintain her composure, even as she marveled at the view of the city that unfolded with each floor. Richard was waiting for them in his office, standing by the window. Upon seeing them enter, his face lit up with a genuine smile. "I'm glad you came. Please have a seat." George remained standing, embarrassed. "Sir, I appreciate the invitation, but I don't really understand why we're here." Richard gestured, indicating the comfortable armchairs. "Please, Mr. George Smith. Mr. Smith, please sit down. I have a story to tell you." In the next few minutes, Richard shared his own journey. He talked about his childhood selling candy at traffic lights, about his mother who worked as a cleaning lady, about the nights studying by candlelight because there wasn't money to pay the electricity bill, and then he told them about the man who changed his life. His name was Charles Rodriguez. He stopped at the traffic light one day, just as I did yesterday, and saw beyond the boy selling candy. He gave me an opportunity, paid for my education, taught me about business. Today I try to honor his memory by doing the same for others. Mary, who until then had maintained a defensive posture, felt her eyes well up. Peter, absorbed by the story, barely blinked. "What exactly are you proposing, sir?" asked George, still cautious. Richard leaned forward. "I want to offer you a job here at the company in the maintenance area. Mary, I noticed your artistic talent from the crafts you sell. We have a scholarship program in design. And Peter, well, every child deserves to study at a good school." The silence that followed was charged with emotion. George, a proud man who had always worked hard to support his family, felt a mix of gratitude and apprehension. "And what do you want in return?" Richard smiled, understanding. "Only that you take advantage of the opportunity, that you study, that you work with dedication, and that one day, when you can, you do the same for other people." At that moment, Carla discreetly entered the room with a tray of coffee and cookies. Peter, still shy, looked longingly at the sweets. "You can have some, Peter," Richard said gently. "By the way, that chocolate truffle I bought yesterday was delicious." "Who made it?" "Our mom," Mary replied proudly. "She makes the best sweets in the neighborhood even when she's sick." Richard saw an opportunity. "And why not turn that into a business?" Mary's eyes sparkled. "What do you mean?" "Our company has a cafeteria on the ground floor. What if we started supplying your mother's sweets there? We could develop a brand, a product line." George, who until then had reservations, began to take interest in the conversation. "My wife has always dreamed of having her own confectionery." "Then let's make that dream a reality," declared Richard. "But first, we need to take care of her health. Do you have health insurance?" The family exchanged worried looks, and Mary answered, "No, sir. Mom's been on the waiting list for public health care for months." "That changes today," Richard affirmed, making some notes. "Carla, please arrange for the family to be included in the company's health insurance plan immediately." The morning progressed with discussions about practical details, filling out documents and planning the next steps. When the family said goodbye, they carried not just promises, but also renewed hope. A week after the meeting at Mendoza Tech, the Smith family's life was beginning to change. Mrs. Cindy, Mary and Peter's mother, had already had her first medical appointment at a private clinic, receiving proper treatment for her condition. George was starting his job at the company, proud of his new uniform and official employment. However, not everything was smooth sailing. Mary was facing her first day in the graphic design course, and the social differences were glaringly obvious. Sitting in the last row of the classroom, she observed her classmates with their latest laptops and brand-name clothes, while she clung to the simple notebook and colored pens she had always used for her drawings. "So you're the Mendoza Tech Scholarship student?" asked a voice beside her. It was Brittany Mendoza, Richard's niece and a well-known figure in the society columns. Her tone revealed a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Yes, that's me," Mary replied, maintaining her dignity. "Interesting. My uncle always had this habit. What does he call it? Oh yes, investing in potential." Brittany smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. I hope you really have talent to justify the investment." Before Mary could respond, the professor began the class. The day's topic was visual identity for big brands, something that made Mary's heart race. In her mind, she was already visualizing the project for her mother's confectionery. Meanwhile, at Mendoza Tech, Richard was facing his own battles. In a board meeting, his decision to invest in social projects was being questioned by some shareholders. "Richard, we understand your enthusiasm," pointed out Albert Vance, one of the oldest board members. "But turning the company into a charity institution is not exactly what investors expect." "It's not charity, Albert," Richard countered, keeping his calm. "It's an investment in human capital. The Smith family is just the beginning. I intend to expand the program to identify and develop talent in underprivileged communities." "And the confectionery. Are you going to turn our corporate cafeteria into a testing ground for amateur candy makers?" Provoked another board member. Richard smiled, picking up his tablet. "Actually, I've already done a market analysis. The gourmet artisanal sweets market is growing 15% per year. With the story behind the brand, we can create a premium product line that will not only generate profit, but also serve as a success story for our social responsibility program." On the other side of the city, Peter was facing his own challenges at his new school. The new uniform and backpack full of school supplies didn't erase years of educational gaps. During math class, his difficulty in keeping up with the content became evident. "Can anyone solve this equation?" asked Mrs. Laura, the teacher, looking around the room. Peter shrunk in his chair, trying to become invisible. That's when he met Luke, a classmate who noticed his discomfort. "Hey, want some help? I can explain it to you after class." Peter looked surprised at the boy next to him. It was the first time someone had offered to help him since he arrived at the school. At the end of the day, the family gathered in their small apartment, recently rented with Richard's help. Mrs. Cindy, still recovering, but with more color in her face, was preparing a batch of chocolate truffles for testing in the company's cafeteria. "How was your first day in the course, honey?" she asked as Mary helped her in the kitchen. Mary hesitated before answering. "Different from what I imagined, Mum. There are a lot of people different from us." "Different how?" "Rich, educated, people who never had to sell anything at traffic lights." Mary sighed, rolling a chocolate truffle with more force than necessary. Mrs. Cindy stopped what she was doing and held her daughter's hands. "Hands, since when is that a problem? Your talent has nothing to do with money or last name. Remember what Mr. Richard said. He also started from scratch." At that moment, George arrived from work carrying a surprise, a refurbished laptop that Richard had made available for Mary to use in the course. "Honey, this arrived for you today," he said, handing over the computer with pride. Mary opened the equipment carefully, finding a note. "To transform your talent into digital art. Keep dreaming big. Richard." At the kitchen table, as the family savored the chocolate truffles that would be presented the next day, each shared their experiences of the day. The difficulties were many, but there was also hope. Peter told about his new friend Luke. George talked about how useful he felt in his new job, and Mary showed her first sketches for the confectionery brand. What they didn't know was that their lives were about to get even more complicated. Brittany. Mendoza wasn't satisfied with her uncle's decisions and was already making plans to prove that the Smith family didn't deserve so much attention. And Richard, in his luxurious penthouse, was looking at old photographs from his childhood, remembering promises made long ago to Charles Rodriguez, his mentor, promises he was now beginning to fulfill. The delicious aroma of Mrs. Cindy's sweets was already a sensation in the Mendoza Tech cafeteria. After a month of adaptation, her gourmet chocolate truffles and homemade cakes were winning over not just the employees, but also clients from neighboring companies who came especially to try the delicacies of Cindy's Sweets, as the brand was beginning to be known. Mary had created a visual identity that blended elegance with warmth, using shades of gold and brown reminiscent of chocolate, with details that told the family's story of overcoming adversity. Her work caught the attention of her design course. Professors and even Brittany had to admit, albeit grudgingly, that the project was impeccable. On a particularly busy morning, while Mrs. Cindy supervised production in the small industrial kitchen that Richard had implemented in the building's basement, an elegant lady approached the cafeteria counter. "These chocolate truffles," she began with a choked voice. "They remind me so much of the ones my mother used to make." Carla, who was nearby, immediately recognized the visitor. It was Helen Rodriguez, widow of Charles Rodriguez, Richard's mentor. Unbeknownst to anyone, Richard had invited Helen to see the project, anxious for her approval. "Mrs. Rodriguez, what an honor to receive you," exclaimed Carla, leading her to a reserved table. "Mr. Mendoza is already on his way down to meet you." Minutes later, Richard arrived hurriedly. Upon seeing Helen, his face lit up with genuine affection. "Helen, I'm so glad you came." "Richard, my dear," she smiled, embracing him. "Charles would be so proud. You haven't just followed in his footsteps, you're doing even more." As they talked, Mrs. Cindy appeared personally to serve a special selection of sweets. Helen tasted each one attentively, and her eyes welled up when she tried one in particular. "This coffee truffle, it's exactly like my mother used to make. The recipe was a family secret that was lost when she passed." Helen paused, emotional. "Mrs. Cindy, where did you learn this recipe?" Mrs. Cindy sat down, invited by Richard. "It was my grandmother who taught me. She worked for many years as a cook in a big house in Brooklyn Heights back in the 50s. Helen's eyes widened. "On Montague Street, a house with a rose garden?" "Yes," exclaimed Mrs. Cindy, surprised. "My grandmother always talked about that garden." "That was my parents' house," revealed Helen, taking Mrs. Cindy's hand. "Was your grandmother Mrs. Zoe, the one who consoled me with chocolate truffles when I cried?" The two women looked at each other in silence, while Richard watched in astonishment at the coincidence of destiny. Or was it more than coincidence? "The world really does come full circle," murmured Helen, wiping away a tear. "Did you know it was your grandmother who taught my mother to make chocolate truffles? And now, so many years later, her granddaughter is here, keeping that tradition alive." At that moment, Mary arrived at the cafeteria carrying her drawing boards. Seeing the scene, she stopped, curious. "Come here, sweetheart," called Mrs. Cindy. "I want you to meet Mrs. Helen. She has an incredible story to tell us." As Helen shared memories of her childhood and the influence of Mrs. Zoe on her family, Brittany observed everything from afar, her face marked by an expression difficult to decipher. In her hands, she held documents that could complicate her uncle's plans. Upstairs, Peter was having his first tutoring session with Luke, who had proved to be not just a friend, but an excellent teacher. The boy was beginning to regain his self-esteem as the subjects started to make sense. "You're very smart, Peter," commented Luke, observing how his friend solved a math problem. "You just needed a chance to learn properly." George, supervising the air conditioning maintenance on the 20th floor, felt increasingly integrated into the team. His colleagues respected him for his dedication and practical experience, and he had already suggested improvements that saved resources for the company. But not everything was happy stories and coincidences of destiny. In the boardroom, Albert Vance was secretly meeting with other dissatisfied members. The success of the Smith family project, instead of allaying their concerns, only increased their fear that Richard was changing the company's profile too much. "We need to act before he turns Mendoza Tech into a social project," argued Albert. "I have contacts interested in buying enough shares to take control." What no one expected was that Brittany, outside the room, was listening to everything carefully. Her expression oscillated between satisfaction at seeing her uncle facing problems and a growing moral uneasiness. After all, as much as she disapproved of Richard's decisions, would it be fair to destroy the dreams of so many people? The success of Cindy's Sweets was beginning to bother more than just the conservative board members. Amanda Torres, owner of a famous chain of confectioneries, observed with growing irritation the lines forming at the Mendoza Tech cafeteria. Several of her corporate clients had migrated to Mrs. Cindy's homemade sweets, attracted not only by the flavor, but also by the story behind the brand. "How does a backyard candy maker manage to steal my customers?" she questioned, nervously flipping through the sales report in her elegantly decorated office. Her son, Philip Torres, the company's marketing director, tried to calm her down. "Mum, maybe we should rethink our strategy. The market is changing. People want authenticity." "Authenticity?" Amanda laughed humorlessly. "What they have is a good marketing story created by that Richard Mendoza, and a story is something we can fabricate too." On the other side of the city, in the Smith family's new home, a modest but comfortable apartment, Mary worked on her laptop late into the night. The confectionery project had become her final assignment for the first module of the course, and she wanted it to be perfect. "Still awake, honey?" Mrs. Cindy appeared at the door, bringing a cup of hot chocolate. "I need to finish this presentation, Mom. Tomorrow I'm showing it to the class, and Brittany never misses an opportunity to criticize me." Mrs. Cindy sat on her daughter's bed. "You know what your great-grandmother Zoe always used to say? Talent with love has no competition. She faced a lot of prejudice in that big house, but she won everyone over with her work." Mary smiled, remembering the encounter with Helen Rodriguez. "It's amazing to think that great-grandma Zoe's recipe connected so many stories, isn't it?" "And it will connect many more," replied Mrs. Cindy, her eyes shining with the dream of owning her own confectionery. At Mendoza Tech, Richard was facing a tense meeting with the main shareholders. Albert Vance presented graphs and projections that suggested risks in the company's new directions. "Investors are worried, Richard," he argued. "First the Smith family, now this confectionery expansion project. It seems we're straying from our core business." Richard remained calm, years of corporate experience evident in his posture. "If you'll allow me," he began, standing up to use the projector, "I'd like to show you some numbers." The graphs that appeared on the screen surprised everyone. The cafeteria's revenue had tripled since the introduction of Cindy's Sweets. The company's media presence had increased significantly, with spontaneous reports about the social responsibility project. The brand value had grown 15% in the last quarter. "Not to mention the internal environment," Richard continued. "Employee turnover has fallen 30% since we started the social development program, and we received over 200 qualified resumes last week, attracted by our new corporate image." While the meeting was happening, Brittany was in the office bathroom, her hands trembling as she held her cell phone. On the screen, a message from Albert: "We already have the buyers. We need your signature as a family member to start the process." The internal conflict consumed her. On one hand, she had always felt that her uncle underestimated her, preferring to invest in strangers like the Smith family. On the other, Helen Rodriguez's words about her late mentor's legacy echoed in her mind. At school, Peter was facing his first important presentation. With Luke's help, he had prepared a project on sustainability that impressed everyone. Teacher Laura couldn't hide her pride in seeing the students' evolution. "Did you see? He could barely divide 2 months. Oh, now he's calculating carbon footprints," she commented in the teacher's lounge. George, during his maintenance rounds, accidentally found a forgotten document in the copier. It was a memo detailing Albert's plans to take control of the company. His heart raced as he read the content, especially the part that mentioned the end of all social projects, including the program that had changed his family's life. The day was ending with a storm forming on the horizon of New York City. In the penthouse of Mendoza Tech, Richard observed the lightning, recalling a crucial conversation with Charles Rodriguez years ago. "One day, Richard, you'll understand that success without purpose is an empty victory," his mentor had said. "True legacy isn't in the numbers, but in the lives you transform." What Richard didn't know was that, at that exact moment, forces were moving to try to destroy everything he had built. The approaching storm wasn't just meteorological, it was the harbinger of a battle that would test not only his values, but also the newly formed bonds between all those lives that destiny had intertwined. Richard's office was silent that night, illuminated only by the glow of the city outside. Brittany sat uneasily in the armchair in front of her uncle's desk, her hands nervously clutching her designer purse. "I signed it, Uncle," she finally confessed, her voice trembling. "Albert convinced me it was best for the company that your social projects were diverting our focus. I didn't know that." That they intended to use your signature for a hostile takeover? Richard completed softly, surprising his niece with his calmness. How did you... George found the memo, he explained. But I needed you to come to me on your own, Brittany. I needed to know if you were still capable of recognizing right from wrong. Tears began to roll down the young woman's face. I always felt left out. You helping strangers while I... Richard stood up, approaching his niece. Maybe I failed. To show you that you never needed to prove your worth to me, Britt. You're my niece, the daughter of my brother who left us too soon. But sometimes we need to learn certain lessons on our own. On the other side of the city, Mary was facing her own ordeal. Amanda Torres had scheduled a meeting at the most elegant cafe in Greenwich Village, supposedly for a new professional proposal. Darling, Amanda began, her smile sharp as a blade, I'll be direct. I have an interesting dossier here about your family. Old debts, some problems your father had with the law in the past. It would be a shame if this came to light right now with the National Social Design Award approaching. Mary felt her blood run cold. Her father had been unjustly accused years ago when he tried to defend a co-worker from fraud. The case was archived, but the stain remained. What do you want? Asked Mary, maintaining her composure. For you to give up the award, and more, I want your great-grandmother Zoe's original recipes, all of them. At school, Peter was experiencing a completely different moment. His first session as a math tutor had been an absolute success. Using chocolate truffles as an example to explain fractions, he had managed to make 3 sixth-grade students finally understand the concept. Peter has a natural gift for teaching, commented Mrs. Laura to Luke, who proudly observed his friend. And to think that a few months ago he could barely keep up with the class. Back at Mendoza Tech, Richard and Brittany were planning their counterattack. The young woman had handed over all the documents she had about the conspiracy, including emails and recordings of meetings. But Uncle, even with all this, they still have my signature on the stock transfer document, pondered Brittany. Maybe that's exactly what we need, Richard replied enigmatically. Sometimes to win a battle you need to let the enemy think they're winning. That night, the Smith family received an unexpected visit in their apartment. Helen Rodriguez had arrived carrying an old recipe box. I found this in the attic, she explained to Mrs. Cindy. These are the original recipes that your grandmother Zoe taught my mother. By the way, there's an interesting note here. The note revealed something surprising. Zoe had officially registered her recipes in 1952, an unusual act for a domestic worker at that time. Helen smiled at the surprise in everyone's eyes. Your grandmother was a woman ahead of her time, Cindy. She knew that one day her recipes would be valuable. And now look, Amanda Torres offering fortunes for them. Mary's eyes widened. How do you know? Darling, you don't live this long in the business world without having good contacts, replied Helen with a shrewd smile. And some people still owe me favors from Charles's time. Richard's phone rang. It was Carla, his assistant, with urgent news. Sir, Albert has just called an extraordinary board meeting for tomorrow. They're going to try to force a vote for your dismissal. Richard looked at Brittany, who nodded decisively. The moment of truth had come. But while their adversaries thought they had all the cards up their sleeve, they had no idea that each of their moves had been anticipated. Tomorrow, said Richard, we're going to show that some stories are priceless, and that some traditions deserve to be preserved, no matter the cost. What none of them knew was that Peter, in his childlike innocence, had found a mathematical solution so simple and brilliant to a company problem that it would change the whole game. Sometimes, the greatest revelations come from the most unlikely sources. The morning of the extraordinary board meeting dawned with a typical New York drizzle. On the 40th floor of Mendoza Tech, the atmosphere was even heavier than the sky outside. Albert Vance arrived early, accompanied by lawyers and allied shareholders, all dressed in impeccable suits and wearing victorious expressions. I've already set aside a box for your belongings, Richard, Albert taunted as he met him in the hallway. Don't worry, I'll be generous with your social projects. I'll give them a month to reorganize. Richard just smiled, that calm smile that always irritated his adversaries. Thank you for your consideration, Albert, but you know how it is, sometimes math surprises us. On the ground floor of the building, the Cindy's Sweets cafeteria was exceptionally busy. Amanda Torres had arrived unexpectedly, accompanied by friendly journalists. "I've come to personally try these chocolate truffles that are causing such a buzz," she announced loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "Although I have serious doubts about the origin of the recipes." Mary, who was organizing an exhibition about the history of Cindy's Sweets for the lobby, felt her blood boil. But before she could react, Helen Rodriguez appeared elegantly. "Amanda, darling, what a pleasant surprise." Her voice dripped with refined irony. "Have you come to learn about Mrs. Zoe's original recipes? The ones she wisely registered in 1952? I'm sure your lawyers would love to see the documentation." Amanda's face paled slightly. At that moment, Peter came running into the cafeteria, carrying his school backpack. Mary, I need to show something to Uncle Richard before the meeting. It's important." On the executive floor, the boardroom was already packed. Albert was preparing to present his proposal for restructuring the company, which basically meant the end of all social projects and a radical shift in the business model. "Gentlemen," he began, "it's clear that the current management has lost focus. A technology company cannot transform itself into a charitable confectionery." He was interrupted by Peter, who burst into the room breathlessly, followed by Mary and Brittany. "Uncle Richard, I solved it. Look." Richard, to everyone's surprise, excused himself and examined the papers the boy brought. They were calculations, apparently simple but revealing something extraordinary. "Peter," Richard smiled, proud, "you really are brilliant." Turning to the board, Richard took the floor. "Gentlemen, before you vote, I'd like you to see this. Peter, our young math prodigy, has developed a social impact analysis model that revolutionizes our view of profitability." The numbers were clear. The social program had generated a return on investment 3 times higher than expected. The Mendoza tech brand had never been so valuable, and the success story of Cindy's Sweets had opened doors for international contracts. "But this is ridiculous," protested Albert. "Are we going to trust the calculations of a child?" "These calculations have already been validated by our finance department," intervened Brittany, standing up. "And there's more. I have evidence here that you, Albert, tried to manipulate the stock value through insider trading." A buzz took over the room. Albert, red with anger, tried his last card. "We still have the document signed by Brittany transferring her shares." "Ah, about that?" Brittany smiled. "I forgot to mention that I was a minor when I signed it. The document has no legal value." In the building's lobby, the exhibition about the history of Cindy's Sweets was attracting a crowd. Helen personally conducted a group of journalists telling the story of Mrs. Zoe and her influence on New York's high society in the 1950s. "And look at this." She showed a framed document, the first official registration of culinary recipes, made by a domestic worker in the United States. Mrs. Zoe was a visionary. Amanda Torres left the building discreetly, her blackmail threats crumbling in the face of the impeccable documentation protecting Zoe's legacy. Back in the boardroom, the vote was quick and decisive. Not only would Richard remain in charge, but his social responsibility program would be expanded. Albert left the room, his corporate career effectively over. Peter, still not fully understanding the impact of his contribution, received hugs and congratulations from everyone. His simple method of social impact analysis, developed during tutoring sessions at school, would now be implemented throughout the company. "You know, Peter," said Richard, affectionately messing up the boy's hair, "sometimes the best solutions come from those who haven't yet learned that something is impossible." That afternoon, the Smith family, along with Helen, Richard, and Brittany, gathered in the cafeteria for a special celebration. Mrs. Cindy had prepared a batch of chocolate truffles using Zoe's original recipe. "To family," Helen toasted, raising her truffle. "Not the one given to us by blood, but the one we build with love, respect, and chocolate truffles." Richard observed the scene with satisfaction. Charles Rodriguez would be proud. The legacy of social transformation he had initiated had not only survived, but flourished in ways no one could have predicted. The auditorium of the convention center was packed for the final of the National Social Design Award. Mary, wearing an elegant blue dress chosen by Brittany, waited backstage, her heart racing. In the front rows, her entire family, including Richard and Helen, waited anxiously. "You look beautiful, honey," said Mrs. Cindy, who had escaped from the audience to give her daughter one last hug. She was unrecognizable in her new look, her hair well arranged, and wearing an outfit that Helen had helped her choose. "Thank you, Mom. But I'm not just nervous for myself," whispered Mary. "It's for everyone who believed in us." On the big screen, images of the Cindy Sweets project alternated with the other finalists. The brand story had captured the public's imagination, becoming a phenomenon on social media. Influencers were lining up to try the chocolate truffles that carried decades of tradition. Peter, sitting between Luke and Mrs. Laura, could barely contain his excitement. He had helped his sister with the project's social impact spreadsheets, applying his newly discovered mathematical knowledge. His tutoring program at school had expanded to other units, and now he dreamed of creating his own method of teaching, math using sweets as examples. And the winner of the National Social Design Award 2025 is, the presenter made a dramatic pause, Mary Smith with the Cindy Sweets project, Flavor and Social Transformation. The explosion of applause was deafening. Mary took the stage with tears in her eyes, but her voice was firm when she began her speech. "This award isn't just mine. It's for my great-grandmother Zoe, who transformed love into recipes. It's for my mother, who never gave up on her dreams. It's for Mr. Richard, who gave us a chance when no one else would. It's for Mrs. Helen, who helped us rediscover our own history." In the audience, Brittany held her uncle's hand, also emotional. In recent weeks, she had dedicated herself to learning more about the family business, no longer as a bored heiress, but as someone who finally understood the true meaning of legacy. Richard observed everything with a serene smile. The project's success had inspired other companies to follow his example. Mendoza Tech now led a transformation movement in the corporate world, proving that social responsibility and profitability could go hand in hand. After the ceremony, a surprise awaited the family. Richard led them to the parking lot, where a personalized van with the Cindy's Sweets logo was parked. "What is this?" asked Mrs. Cindy, confused. "Your new food truck," replied Brittany, handing over the keys. "Now Cindy's Sweets can travel all over the city." "But this must have cost a fortune," exclaimed George, impressed with the fully equipped vehicle. "Actually," intervened Helen, "it was a joint gift. Richard, Brittany and I thought it was time for Cindy's Sweets to hit the streets." Mary inspected the interior of the food truck in wonder, where every detail of the visual identity she had created had been perfectly incorporated. Her mother was already mentally planning the first routes and events. "And there's one more surprise," announced Richard. "The City Hall approved our proposal. The professional confectionery training project will start next month, with Mrs. Cindy as the main instructor. Me, a teacher." Mrs. Cindy brought her hands to her face, emotional. "Who better to teach than someone who knows every step of the journey?" smiled Helen. "Your grandmother Zoe would be proud." Peter tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, can I use the food truck to give math lessons too? We can explain geometry using the shapes of the sweets." Everyone laughed, but Peter was serious. His project of teaching mathematics through confectionery was already taking shape in his creative mind. The night ended with an impromptu celebration in the new food truck parked in front of the convention center. Curious passers-by approached, attracted by the irresistible aroma of Mrs. Cindy's chocolate truffles. "You know," Richard commented to Helen, observing the scene, "when Charles helped me years ago, he said that one day I would understand that true success is seeing others grow." Helen smiled, her eyes shining with memories. "And now you understand." "Now I understand," confirmed Richard, watching Mary animatedly explain the design elements to some customers while Peter used chocolate truffles to demonstrate fractions. 6 months after the award ceremony, the Cindy's Sweets food truck was parked in front of the former Rodriguez mansion in Brooklyn Heights. The mansion, now transformed into the Charles Rodriguez Institute for Social Entrepreneurship, was opening its doors to its first class of students. Mrs. Cindy, wearing an apron with the logo created by Mary, was preparing for her first class as an instructor. The improvised classroom in the mansion's former kitchen was filled with eager students, all coming from social projects supported by Mendoza Tech. "Welcome to the first social confectionery class," she began, her voice trembling, slightly with emotion. "Today we're going to learn more than recipes. We're going to learn that each sweet carries a story, a dream, a possibility of transformation." In the garden, where the old rose bushes had been restored, Helen supervised the installation of a commemorative plaque. "In memory of Mrs. Zoe, may her sweets continue to sweeten generations." Beside her, Richard and Brittany discussed the Institute's next steps. "The investors are impressed with the results," Brittany commented, now fully involved in managing the company's social projects. "3 other corporations already want to replicate our inclusive business model." Mary, who divided her time between working as the creative director of Cindy's Sweets and consulting for social enterprises, was coordinating a photo session for the brand's new campaign. The images captured not just the products, but the stories of transformation behind them. "Each package will have a QR code," she explained to the team. "When scanned, it will show the story of the student who produced that sweet as part of the training project." Peter, who had grown a few inches in recent months, was leading his own revolution at school. His sweet math project had transformed into an official program, with weekly classes in the food truck parked in the schoolyard. Students lined up to learn fractions and geometry through sweets. "The secret is to show that math is everywhere," he explained to a group of visiting teachers. "Even in the chocolate truffle we eat." George, in addition to his work at Mendoza Tech, had become a mentor for new employees coming from social projects. His experience and sensitivity helped others adapt to the corporate environment without losing their roots. On a particularly special afternoon, the whole family gathered in the mansion's garden for an intimate celebration. It was the 1-year anniversary of their first encounter at the traffic light. "Sometimes I think it was destiny," reflected Mrs. Cindy, serving chocolate truffles to everyone. "As if Mrs. Zoe had guided Mr. Richard to that traffic light that day." "Maybe it was," smiled Helen. "Some stories are too sweet to be just coincidence." Richard observed the scene with satisfaction. The garden was full of life, with Institute students milling about, the aroma of chocolate truffles in the air, and the sound of laughter echoing through the corridors of the old mansion. In one corner, Peter animatedly explained his teaching method to a group of interested educators. In another, Mary showed her portfolio to potential social clients. Brittany approached her uncle, offering him a chocolate truffle. "You know, Uncle, I finally understood what Uncle Charles always said about building bridges instead of walls." "And what did you understand?" "That sometimes, to find our path, we need to help others find theirs." In the food truck, now a permanent part of the Institute's scenery, a new batch of chocolate truffles was coming out of the oven. The sweet aroma mixed with the scent of roses from the garden, creating a magical atmosphere that made everyone feel at home. "Grandma Zoe always said," recalled Mrs. Cindy, "that the secret isn't in the recipe, but in the love we put into it." And look, how much love has multiplied from her recipes. The sun was beginning to set in New York City, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. In the garden of the old mansion, now a space of transformation and hope, old and new, stories intertwined like the ingredients of a perfect recipe. And it all began with an encounter at a traffic light, a chocolate truffle, and the courage to believe that everyone deserves a chance to realize their dreams. Richard looked at the sky, thinking of his mentor, Charles Rodriguez. "Mission accomplished. My friend," he whispered, "mission accomplished." The legacy of Mrs. Zoe, transformed and multiplied through generations, would continue to sweeten lives and transform stories, proving that the true flavor of success lies in the ability to share it with others.